Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending. This test case is entitled Developing Capacity to Conduct Proactive Post-Marketing Safety Surveillance of Intervertebral Body Fusion Devices Using EHR Data. And I'll briefly introduce the participants for this panel, including myself. My name is Keondae Irvin. I am a project manager, the research end at NEST. We also have Dr. Paul Coughlin, Vice President and Global Head of Medical Device Epidemiology and Real-World Data Sciences at Johnson & Johnson. We have Dr. Ron Jean, Director, Division of Spinal Devices in OHT6 Office of Orthopedic Devices, Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the FDA. We also have Dr. Fred Resnick, Chairman, Division of Cardiovascular Medicine and Co-Director, Comparative Effectiveness Research Institute at the Lahey Hospital Medical Center. And we also have Dr. Shuming Zhang, Director of Regulatory Real-World Evidence and Epidemiology of Medical Devices at Johnson & Johnson. So this test case focused on EHR data sources in a retrospective manner. And the project lasted roughly 12 months of the phase 1 study. That phase 1 study was recently completed earlier in the year, and now the study has moved on to a second phase. Obviously, the disease area being orthopedic and the technology of interest being intervertebral body fusion devices, which is considered a class 2 medical device, and this is a surveillance study in the total product life cycle. What I'm going to discuss today will really focus on the relevance to NEST in the test case arena, and then I'll also discuss the role that NEST played in this test case. One of the main criterion for selecting this test case is that their real-world evidence is extracted from EHR data to improve the safety and performance surveillance of a medical device. And the importance of this test case to the ecosystem at large is post-marketing surveillance of these devices are quite challenging because of the complex nature of spinal surgeries. And also key aims were to determine the feasibility of EHR data to improve surveillance, device surveillance, as well as to assess the data and capabilities of our specific network collaborators. And within the NEST role of the test case, curate the appropriate data sources and research expertise to meet the specific objectives, aims of the test case, and also facilitating the engagement of test case participants through project management structures, studying milestones, assessing risk, and ensuring that regular reporting was done throughout the research period of performance. Also, NEST played a role in developing the collaborative efforts and communications of the test case team, as well as aligning with the FDA throughout the study. And obviously, one of the final points, but probably the most important points, reviewing scientific submissions such as a study protocol, preliminary scientific results, final scientific results, to ensure scientific rigor and quality of data and methodology in the execution of the research to ensure that very high quality of evidence generated. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Shuming Zhang.
Thank you. Today's discussion will focus on 4 topics. What is the need? What did we do to address the need? What did we find? Why is this relevant? I'm going to give some background information why J&J proposed the original test case. We thought the next test case would be a great opportunity to advance the post-marketing surveillance of medical devices. In medical device research, registry has been a major data source. However, registry may not exist for all devices, are slow to accrue patient exposure to devices, may have small numbers, are resource intensive, can have a high drop-off rate, may have selection bias due to a skilled, experienced operator included in the registry. Early detection of the safety problem and expedited addressing the problem benefits everybody. Large EHR and claim databases may be able to address some of the limitations of the registry. However, they may lack of data on specific devices or study endpoints. The goal of the NEST test case is to assess the feasibility of using real-world evidence derived from the electronic health record databases to improve the device surveillance. Therefore, NEST test case would be a great opportunity to look at this. In addition, intervertebral body devices for spinal fusion did not have easily accessible clinical study or registry data. Furthermore, NEST test case would also provide opportunity to collaborate with the FDA in developing use of real-world evidence from electronic health record for safety and performance surveillance. Next, please. This NEST test cases focus on the carbon fiber reinforced polymer PEEK and titanium versions of Concord bullet cages, which are the model numbers starting from 1878 and 1969. Key feature of a Concord bullet interbody cage is the bulleted nose, which is designed to facilitate the insertion into the interbody space. Concord bullet offers 3 tantalum markers in the carbon fiber reinforced polymer PEEK version, which allow for verification of the cage placement and the positioning using the X-ray. The cages also have ridges and teeth that resist the rotation and the migration, and have cavities to accept the bone graft packing. The Concord bullet was cleared through the 510K pathway. It's indicated for use as the intervertebral body fusion devices in the skeletally mature patients with degenerative disc disease at 1 or 2 contiguous levels of the lumbar spine. Additionally, Concord bullet can also be used in patients diagnosed with spinal deformities as adjunct to fusion. These implants are used to facilitate the fusion in the lumbar spine, are placed through either a posterior or transforaminal approach. Concord bullet is also indicated for use in the thoracic lumbar spine to replace a deceased vertebral body resected or recessed for the treatment of tumors to achieve anterior decompression of the spinal cord and neural tissues, and to restore the height of a collapsed vertebral body. These systems are also indicated for treating the fracture of thoracic and lumbar spine. Now I'm going to turn over to Dr. Fred Rosnick. He's going to discuss the study methods, result interpretation. Fred?
Thank you, Dr. Zhang. So we can go to the next slide. So Leahy Medical Center and the Comparative Effectiveness Research Institute was selected to participate on the both data procurement side as well as the analytics side of this study. And the goals of this initial phase of the project were to validate the data warehouse capabilities to enable efficient surveillance of the data of the safety of lumbar intervertebral body implants. So I'm using the acronym IVBI. And we needed to validate that we could get the device exposures, the comparator information, risk factor identification, and outcomes that were deemed necessary to study the safety of this device. We also wish to describe the cohort of patients who were treated with IVBI at our facilities and to apply an active surveillance method, the acronym being DELTA, to assess for risk-adjusted IVBI safety outcomes. Next. So the data source and data validation. Leahy Health System is now a part of a larger health system over the course of this study. But for this analysis, we had 5 hospitals as part of the network in Eastern Massachusetts. We use a common EPIC EHR implementation. The EHR contains the records of 3.4 million individuals, and there's additional patient-reported outcomes for all spine surgeries performed at the Leahy hospitals because of particular interest by our neurosurgeons in collecting this information. We're able to certainly merge those 2 data sets. And so we create a monthly de-identified data extract using the OMA data model, and it contains typical ontologies from the EHR, including captured clinical information, laboratory information, as well as billing information, coding information. We did validate key covariates and outcomes with random samples of 5% from all cases of the exposures as well as the comparator groups. And we sought to validate and review all the clinical and outcome variables, and we successfully did that. We had greater than 98% accuracy in the acquisition of data, and we really had our trouble, the 2% error rate, was in identifying alternative devices, and that really is driven by we did not yet implement UDI in the ORs for spinal and orthopedic devices, so that is now ongoing in our routine data capture. Next, please. So now that we had a data set we believe to be validated, the study was well described in a protocol that was distributed and accepted by all members of the investigative team, including NESTcc and certainly the sponsor. We included all adult patients over 18 who were undergoing thoracic or lumbar spinal fusion surgery from April 2015 through the end of 2018. We excluded if the surgical procedure included any intervention on the cervical spine or was an emergency, or if the patient had had surgery on their spine in the previous 12 months. We were able to look through the electronic capture of the surgical log for those specific model numbers that Dr. Zhang mentioned. And the safety endpoints are noted on the right side of the slide here, and the primary safety outcome, which is what I'll be describing, is the proportion of patients undergoing any repeat reoperation on the spine within 12 months, with the hope being that we would not see a difference between the patients treated with the conquered bullet implant versus those treated with alternative fusion surgeries. Next slide. We needed to adjust for the risk of patients. And of course, this is the complex step in any comparative safety analysis. And so we had to find, our method was to look for a comparison population. And so we looked for patients who were treated with specific alternative devices, and for that we used the Deploy Opal Spacer or the Medtronic Capstone Peak device as 2 comparable devices. But recognizing that the population were small and that the sample size might be a risk for a meaningful analysis, we also defined another population, was that patients who were treated not with the conquered bullet and not with those alternative devices, but had the same indication for surgery, the same surgical procedure of a fusion of the lumbar or thoracic spine. We trialed 2 different risk adjustment methods. One was one-to-one propensity matching, and the other was the inverse probability treatment weighting, which was used to try to minimize the loss of cases, again, trying to maximize the sample size. We included 12 demographic clinical variables in the propensity model, and we calculated significance through a comparison of proportions using the Wilson method. We also included a falsification hypothesis, which is commonly done to assess for the potential for residual confounding. And in this case, we looked at the subsequent risk of developing new renal dysfunction, which was not thought to be likely predicted by the selection of any particular device. And I'll mention that very quickly. So on the left shows us our cohort identification, starting with over 1,000 patients who underwent, rather, procedures that were captured with the implant of the different pre-specified devices. But you can see that as we start excluding patients who have other exclusion criteria, such as a cervical spine surgery or a prior lumbar or thoracic spine surgery, we exclude a number of patients, and we have a total number of study cases, third row from the bottom, of 392. Of these, 136 patients had received the Concord Bullet alone, and 98 patients had received the alternative, pre-specified alternative devices. That's the Opal or the Peak device. And unfortunately, 158 patients out of the 392 had both. That is, they had both a Concord Bullet as well as one of the alternatives. We excluded that population as we could not really designate an outcome, a subsequent outcome, to one or the other of the devices. So we included only those patients who received exclusively the Concord Bullet or exclusively the alternative. On the right is just a pie chart showing that about 24% of patients who were treated with fusion surgery received the Concord Bullet device. Next slide. So there's way too much information on the next few slides, or a few slides, so I leave them for your review by pausing, but I will simply guide the overall landscape of the slide. On the upper right of the slide, next to the NEST logo, is simply a designation of which of the 4 cohorts of analysis that were performed, pre-specified through our protocol. This is our primary analysis, and what this is showing is a comparison of those patients who received Concord Bullet versus the alternative, the predefined alternative IBBIs. The left-sided graph is the density distribution of the propensity scores. And in this plot, in blue are those patients who received the Concord Bullet. In green, the patients who received the alternative. And there is a significant overlap between those two populations. And in fact, the median, which would be the peak of this plot, is similar for both. On the right side is our propensity match covariate balancing table. This lists all the covariates that were included in the risk adjustment. The first set of data in the first section lists the population according to treatment, that is, receiving the Concord Bullet or the alternative before any attempt to match. The next population but is after the exclusions, and those exclusions included a complex surgery, a third level, more than 2 levels, 2 spinal levels. So this took a narrower subset in this analysis than the original 136. So after the propensity match, we end up with only 62 patients in each population, and that's shown in the second section of this large table. And in that table, it lists the proportion or the mean and standard deviation for each of the covariates. And what one can see is a great increase in the similarity and the comparativeness between the Concord Bullet treated patients and the alternative treated patients in each of the covariates. And so while there may be significant differences in the rates of diabetes in the pre-match, that first set of columns, it balances out tremendously in the second after the match. Now, that's by taking patients who are very similar to one another using a caliper method for identifying a one-to-one match for every patient treated. Now, we were able to match 76.5% of patients, and we were able to balance most of the covariates, but there were 3 that were still slightly imbalanced, that is, greater than 10% difference in the standardized mean difference. Next slide, please. So this is our outcomes that we had predefined. So the top row is the reoperation rate in the matched population. And you can see that there were no reoperations for either group. So when we look at patients who are very comparable to one another, we can see that they had no adverse events as defined by reoperation. The next three items were mortality at 1 year, any hospitalization at a year, and blood transfusion. And these are also shown in the graphs at the bottom, which are a typical output of the safety monitoring tool that we use, the delta analysis method. And while some of these event rates were greater than zero, such as hospitalizations and blood transfusions, there were no significant differences between those patients treated with a Concord bullet versus those treated with the alternative device. And in those graphs at the bottom, one is looking at the accumulating information as we move from left to right. It's the time index along the x-axis, and showing us that the event rates tend to fall within the 95% confidence interval of the predicted range. Next slide, please. So this is now just using our alternative method. The propensity match, as I mentioned, threw out some number of patients. We ended up with only 62 patients, but we started with 81 that qualified for this cohort. And in this case, we can look at our same four outcomes, but by not eliminating any cases, but rather simply weighting them by their likelihood of having been treated with the device of interest, that is the Concord bullet. We're also able to get an assessment of what the odds ratio for these adverse outcomes. The top row is the primary outcome, where we can see that the odds ratio is 1.01, and certainly there is no significant difference, but there is no difference in any of these outcomes in this primary cohort sample using the IPTW, which maximizes the amount of information that we're sort of gathering from the observed cases. Next slide, please. And just to mention that we did have that alternative hypothesis looking at late kidney failure or late renal dysfunction. And what we're doing here is simply looking at the same patients, but whether they developed an outcome that we would not have predicted related in any way to the choice of the device or the implant or surgery. Listed here from top to bottom are the four cohorts that we analyzed as part of our protocol. The top row being the data that I just presented. There is a similar amount of data for each of the subsequent rows, which have increasing number of patients included, broadening the inclusion criteria, basically. But you can see that in any of these cases, there was no significant increase in relative risk for the development of late kidney dysfunction, indicating that there was unlikely to be a significant amount of residual confounding, although with small data sets, we still need to be cautious. Next slide, please. So in terms of interpreting the study, we need to always keep in mind the limitations. This was really an exploratory study, really focused about a single center. We have one high volume neurosurgical center, which does the great majority of these cases. We did have limited sample size, as you could see, especially when we did the propensity matching in the most restrictive inclusion criteria. We also were limited in the time period that we were following up, and we had the lack of simple device identification without having access to UDI. Importantly, from our clinical experts, the absence of correlative imaging data can compromise our ability to really understand the severity of spine illness going into surgery, and that may limit our ability to predict adverse outcomes. And it's a retrospective study, and all retrospective studies do have the risk of residual confounding. So as we interpret these results, we believe that the Concord bullet intervertebral body stabilization system was not associated with any adverse safety signals when compared to patients treated with alternative IVBIs, with fusion surgery, and even those treated with fusion surgery without an identified IVBI. Those were those later cohorts. The Delta system was successfully used to monitor EHI-derived safety outcome data in the spine surgery domain, which was a unique application of that system. But we certainly believe we need to understand more comprehensive device performance beyond safety to get an overall performance understanding of this novel technology. And with that, I turn it over to Dr. Copeland from J&J.
Thank you, Dr. Resnick. Next slide, please. So why is the study relevant and the findings of the study? Well, we've seen a number of examples in medical devices where real-world evidence in the form of registries has been used for label extensions or for post-marketing safety surveillance. But figuring out how real-world evidence outside of registries can be used to assess patient outcomes is important for patients, for regulators, and for companies who want to do post-marketing surveillance to unlock huge amounts of real-world data that is collected in electronic health records or hospital claims or other kind of usual care practice records to understand the safety and effectiveness of medical devices. So we had a chance to present the results of this test case, which we call phase 1, to the Office of Health Technology 6, which is the reviewing division for orthopedics, for spine, and Dr. Jean from FDA will talk in a few minutes. And this discussion made us aware that there were several comments from the FDA senior staff that radiographic images would be needed for the real-world evidence study to be used to support regulatory decisions. That's because the indication is in part to fusion of vertebra, and therefore radiographic images to support that the fusion has occurred is particularly important. But in general, radiographic imaging seems to be quite important for real-world evidence studies of orthopedic applications. Now, radiographic images are very rarely available in EHR databases or hospital databases. Fortunately, Leahy has them in an accessory database to the electronic medical record system. And so this provides us an opportunity to compare the information content of the safety endpoints from the radiographic images, the radiographic reports, which is what would be summarized from the radiographic images by the physician in the medical record system, patient-reported outcomes, and then the traditional EHR type endpoints that we saw early in the study, such as revisions or rehospitalizations or bleeds and transfusions. So we can compare these 4 types of measures and see what kind of information we can get from these and how much incremental information do we get from each one of these types of endpoints. So we proposed this to NEST as a phase 2 study, and NEST thought this would be important to, NEST Coordinating Center thought this would be important study to continue. And so we have received additional funding to continue with this work and compare these 4 types of outcomes. So I'll now turn it over to Dr. Jean from the Office of Health Technology 6 at FDA to provide some comments from the FDA's perspective on the study.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be participating in this forum to discuss NEST test cases, and specifically to be providing commentary related to the spinal device research case study. I'd like to frame my comments by describing the regulatory landscape for intervertebral body fusion devices. Most of these devices are regulated under premarket notification, otherwise known as the 510(k) pathway, when intended for intervertebral fusion as identified under 21 CFR 888.3080. Under the 510(k) regulatory paradigm, we clear, not approve, devices that are found substantially equivalent to a legally marketed predicate device. In other words, one already cleared for market or pre-amendments. Non-clinical testing for these devices has been developed and is usually sufficient to make a determination of substantial equivalence, although non-traditional designs or a new intended use may require clinical data to support marketing. Next slide, please. When evaluating clinical data or literature supplied in support of intervertebral body fusion devices, some important elements that we consider include, but are not limited to, the indications for use. For intervertebral body fusion devices, the indications for use generally include treatment of degenerative conditions, but may include other spinal conditions such as deformity. The type of fill material used within an intervertebral body fusion device may lead to different performance outcomes, as well as dictate a different regulatory pathway. So this information is also critical. The NEST test case related to intervertebral body fusion devices and supported by Leahy, PedsNet, and Johnson & Johnson represents the first venture in the spinal device product sector under this program and should be lauded for its thorough and rigorous methodology. A successful ingredient to borrow from this test case is the collaboration and communication between the stakeholders involved. FDA interacted with the Leahy J&J team at several points during the study over the last year, and their openness to feedback is evident in the phase 2 study attempting to address the need for additional endpoints such as radiographic data. This study was intended to evaluate whether real-world evidence could enhance device post-market surveillance, and there was no outstanding safety or effectiveness question related to the devices in this test case. While the generation of real-world data holds multiple applications where data collection is reliable and relevant, in this case, the results may serve to validate the safety and effectiveness of the devices under study, as well as lead to labeling changes, serve as surrogate data for other marketing applications or device refinements down the road. Next slide, please. I also want to take a moment to honor the memory of Dr. Doug Dumont, an FDA employee and AIMBE scholar who was instrumental early on in leading the Leahy, J&J, and FDA discussions in this test case. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. And now we will take some questions.